Ina mana, ina reo, I hui hui mai nei, no mai e raro I te kotahi, tēnā koutou katoa. A greeting to you from New Zealand in New Zealand's Indigenous language, Te Reo Māori. I'd like to say thank you very much to Anthony and his colleagues for the invitation today. It's a pleasure to be here. If Lynn gave Gregor a set of very clear, firm writing instructions about a tutorial approach, I think she did the reverse for me, which was to invite me to share some experience about the development of a micro-credentials regime that has occurred over recent months in New Zealand, and to reflect on some of the context for the introduction of a micro-credentials system. By way of footnote first, Anthony's touched on some of the elements of the New Zealand Qualifications Authority, which is that it sets the examinations, sets and marks examinations for the high school system. It is responsible for the New Zealand Qualifications Framework, and it regulates quality in 500 non-university tertiary education organisations. So it has a particular distinct perspective on issues as a consequence for that secondary school assessment system and that ownership of the development of the New Zealand Qualifications Framework. And you'll see some of the comments that I'll make about the micro-credential system are broad reflections on whether the qualifications system itself is always fit for purpose. So I'd like really to be making 3 or 4 key arguments this morning. The first is that although we could see micro-credentials as a critical addition to the New Zealand education and training system, in order to legitimise components of learning that are smaller than qualification-sized credit values, we would argue it's also critical as a disruptor. It is supporting government agencies and institutions to think differently about education and training and about education products. And that brings me to my second broad argument, which is that the increased interest in micro-credentials and demand for micro-credentials, we think, should be interpreted not simply as a reflection of the changing nature of work, but actually is commentary or critique about the nature of the qualifications system. And perhaps I could outline a couple of very stark future scenarios. Full and formal, face-to-face delivered qualifications, ideally with on-campus experiences, will remain the norm. And there is no data to support there being any other real student demand. At the same time, the changing nature of work may mean that increasingly throughout their life, individuals may need additional bits of training that could be delivered through micro-credentials. So that is one future worldview at one end of the spectrum. An alternative worldview is that just as online learning and online delivery has been a response to whether the face-to-face modality adequately meets stakeholder needs, micro-credentials could be seen as commentary on whether full and formal qualifications, where knowledge is front-loaded and is expected to last for a lifetime, is in fact viable and realistic. So in this other worldview, in fact, the role of qualifications may fundamentally change over time. So just as online learning has become mainstreamed into the education system, it could be that micro-credentials become so mainstreamed that in the medium to long term, individuals are showing digital portfolios of their experiences, which include internships, other types of experiences with companies, travel, wide-ranging interests, micro-credentials that regularise and capture non-formal qualification learning. So in that worldview, micro-credentials are a Trojan horse or an early sign of much more fundamental change in our education, training, qualification and credential system. Doubtless the truth lies somewhere in the middle of those two extremes. So let me describe the New Zealand approach to micro-credentials, and we're conscious that there are many different approaches worldwide. There's significant interest in the development of micro-credentials, and we believe that first and foremost it should be understood as a regularising of the enormous variety of education and training activity that already occurs outside of the full and formal qualification system. And in some countries those things are referred to as short courses, short awards, community-based education. For us, micro-credentials is an opportunity to regularise that activity by way of giving it a level on the qualifications framework and giving it a credit value. So we think that employers and learners may be better placed to understand the duration, the complexity of short chunks of learning if it has been given a place on the qualifications framework. And so our system has two different parts, and let me just say how we define a micro-credential. It's between a credit value of 5 and 40. So a certificate qualification starts at 40 credits, and therefore we've kept micro-credentials as a maximum of 40 credits. And the emphasis for future government funding of micro-credentials is likely to be in response to skill needs that are not currently met by the formal qualification system, and in particular in priority areas. So, for example, the totality of education spend on primary sector training in New Zealand is surprisingly low in comparison to the importance of the agriculture sector for export receipts. And so the government funding agency is proposing to give particular emphasis to financial support for micro-credentials in potentially the agriculture sector. But in areas where there are new technologies which require immediate responses and which it's not realistic for programs to be developed in a timely fashion, that will be an emphasis for micro-credentials. So we have one track for micro-credentials from existing quality assured providers, and that goes through a program approval process in the same way as a certificate, a diploma, a degree, a master's degree, a doctorate. So the New Zealand Qualifications Authority will take a micro-credential application between 5 credits and 40 credits and give it a place on the framework. There is a separate approach for organisations that are not quality assured entities. So we've done a pilot with the US-based technology trainer Udacity, and in that particular micro-credential, which was on self-driving or autonomous vehicle engineering, we levelled that micro-credential at 60 credits at level 9 on the framework. And in our jurisdiction, where we relate credit value to qualification type so strongly, it's quite disruptive to think of 60 credits at level 9 on the framework, because we are used to thinking only of level 9 being associated with 180 credits or 240 credits. And so helping to free up providers and non-providers to think about offering, developing training responses to unmet skill needs at any level of the framework, irrespective of those old linkages to particular credit values, is an illustration of the point that micro-credentials can be disruptive. So one of the things in a country of only 5 million people is that we need to be able to access learning that is available internationally online. And we need some systems to enable local employers and learners to understand the value and the level of that learning. So if I go back to the Udacity example, which is an organisation that offers a huge amount of technology-related training, potentially of value to learners and to the New Zealand economy. By showing the link between packages of learning against the framework, it legitimizes, it raises the profile of shorter components of learning that are offered by non-traditional organisations. So our goal is to increase variation, increase participation, but simultaneously to increase knowledge and understanding by using that link back to the New Zealand qualifications framework. Now, let me return to this issue of whether the development of micro-credentials and the interest from employers is in fact just a proxy for their disappointment, perhaps with the relevance, with the flexibility of qualifications. Our own analysis of micro-credentials is that we have to see it as one of a number of activities in order to increase flexibility, responsiveness and relevance of the education and training system. So those employers who are now hankering after rapid micro-credentials to meet their training needs may be doing a number of things. One is they may be underestimating the longer-term skill development needs of their workforces. They may be focusing on immediate short-term needs, such as getting kiwi fruit pickers into the fields with adequate training in the forthcoming season, rather than the higher level training that those and other workers will need for a successful kiwi fruit industry. So one of the things we're trying to do is to ensure that the qualification review cycle can be shortened. Typically qualifications are reviewed every 5 years, but we're really sending a message to employers that it's critical that they are voicing their concern about the duration or the relevance of programs. And, you know, if we are absolutely objective and if we listen to what employers tell us, there may be a mismatch between the convenience of programs and qualifications which are 1 year, 2 years and 3 years of duration, which fit perfectly the needs of tertiary education organisations for funding, for employment purposes, for capital investment, but may be an imperfect match for what it is that employers want. And certainly in the New Zealand context, programs are almost always of a duration that fits an academic year. And I think we have to acknowledge that increasingly employers are expressing concern and cynicism about whether training and education products are always meeting workforce and skill development needs. And for those non-vocational areas of study, of course arguments can be made about the competencies that are developed and remain relevant for a lifetime of study. But in many areas of education and training, there is a strong link, or there ought to be a strong link, to what employers say they need. So one of the mechanisms that we're using is to try and ensure that employer voice is becoming more important in our approach to qualification approval, qualification review. Another, of course, is that if policy systems, funding systems and QA systems have privileged the position of providers in this provision of education and training, it follows that government may need to keep reviewing some of those funding settings in particular. And if you think about the weight that we have all given to qualification completion as a proxy for quality, certainly in our system, it does not acknowledge the flexibility that employers and learners always need. So in the New Zealand context, we have utterly incentivised providers to focus only on full, formal, largely long-term, on-campus qualifications through the funding mechanisms. In our system, institutions have been, and still are right now, but it's under review, have been penalised for having a good course completion rate but a poor qualification completion rate. So micro-credentials potentially, if we can find a way to value them, may become this way of in effect disrupting our thinking about the role of qualifications themselves. So that's one of the New Zealand Qualification Authority's interests. And we do assume that over time individuals will have very rich, diverse electronic portfolios that follow them through their education and working lives. And we think that there are emerging signs that employers will value a set of attributes and competencies and skills that are not simply represented through the proxy of a long-term, front-end loaded, formal on-campus qualification. Okay, let's turn to the question of the relationship between micro-credentials, online learning, and quality assurance. So one of our assumptions is that many micro-credentials will end up being delivered through online mechanisms, and we are, as a consequence, of course, grappling with whether we understand enough the modality of online learning. But I think Gregor made a very important point, which is that because of some of the assumptions about uneven and variable quality in online learning, we may be looking for a level of detail or comfort that is at odds with what we do in other delivery modes. And I think we have to take into account that unlike some forms of on-campus learning, online learning gives us the ability through the data analytics to much better understand student engagement with materials, with the learner, with the instructor, in a way that actually produces a much better and richer data set about learner responses to the course design, to the assessment types, to the modality of learning. And so one of the things we're trying to do is not to overreact to this increase in online learning and the possibility that many micro-credentials will be delivered through online learning. In fact, we're trying to do the opposite, which is to challenge ourselves about whether, in fact, it's necessary for a government quality assurance agency to always have full quality assurance over all dimensions of education delivery. So could it be that some of the rich learner responses to the active engagement and some of the survey-based information, which is likely to be more plentiful and completed at higher rates where the learner is in an online mode, could it be that that information and the publicity of that information is a more effective QA mechanism than a central government agency attempting to look over the shoulder of a provider? So student endorsements through online mechanisms may tell a potential learner a great deal more, in fact, than a government agency is capable of seeing, understanding, or reporting. And so rather than scrambling to find new layers of compliance around quality assurance for online learning, we are trying to step back and ask ourselves whether actually the very modality itself does much of that for us. So clearly we have a responsibility as a gate to ensure that only organisations of high quality get into the system. And we have an obligation to ensure that there's some kind of periodic evaluative review which deeply looks at the characteristics of an organisation. But outside of risk-profiled delivery issues, it's not clear to us that a quality assurance agency needs to be over the detail of the mechanism of teaching and learning. And I would just, make this note that we certainly do see risks in our own system, and you may have some of them here. So in the last 15 months, we've closed about 10 institutions on the basis of poor quality provision. So, our perspective does not emerge from some, rosy-eyed view about the uniformity of quality in the system. And we think in particular where there's where there's delivery for international students, and where that delivery takes place at branch campuses, where there are no domestic students, and where that provision is targeted to particular international markets, we think there are extremely high risk. And as a consequence, we take away assessments and we remark those assessments. We look at the assessment item to determine whether it's at the right level of the qualifications framework. We look at whether the marking judgments are sensible, and we look at the moderation of those. But I stress we only do those things in areas of targeted high risk. So I just want to be very clear that our view that it may not be helpful to climb into the detail of online delivery any more than one would for face-to-face delivery is not based on some kind of, rosy-eyed, naive view of the world. It's based on an understanding that, in fact, you are all in a position to much better demonstrate how the learner has engaged, what their success is, how they've tracked and developed through a program. So so let me try and just draw out a few summary points then. The first is that we recognise that the delivery of micro-credentials is likely to involve a lot more online delivery nationally, and also access to international online delivery. We don't feel the need to quality assure the offshore providers. We only feel a need to look at the component of learning and make a judgment about whether that component of learning is at a particular credit value and a particular level on the framework. You can imagine as a quality assurance agency, it's been difficult to get ourselves into a place where we are prepared to evaluate components of learning and give them recognition on the New Zealand qualifications framework without actually quality assuring the organisation or its subsequent delivery. Of course, there are some thresholds and bars to have a component of learning assessed in the first place, but we are trying to increase variation across the system and ensure that smaller components of learning have this ability to be stackable over time, have this ability to be recognised and legitimated. And we think that that may over time prove to be disruptive to the education and training system in a way that is helpful rather than in a way that undermines qualifications where they are appropriate. So we've also seen micro-credentials and we've also seen online learning as not only important in themselves but as a message to us in a policy, a funding and a QA sense that learners, employers, in our case iwi, the Māori tribes, are not always getting what they want out of a formal qualifications system. And so as the entity responsible for the development of that framework, we are determined that it will be more flexible, it will show a wider range of education products over time, and at the same time we are reviewing the level descriptors inside the New Zealand qualifications framework to see whether some of those descriptors in the domains of knowledge and skill and attributes can be re-specified so that some of the employer expectations on transferable skills, transversal skills, 21st century skills can be better reflected in the level descriptors inside the framework. I know the Australian qualifications framework is currently being reviewed. One of the questions relates to the possible role of micro-credentials. I'm not sure that that review is looking as explicitly as the 21st century attributes that we are trying to reflect in our framework. So for us, in summary, the introduction of a micro-credential system is not just about regularising these smaller chunks of learning. It's an opportunity to think more deeply about whether the system as a whole is sufficiently responsive, flexible, and is meeting the needs of stakeholders. So, Lynn, I've followed your expectation of a general ramble rather than a tutorial. So it remains only to say thank you very much.